Hello, Rams, and welcome to another episode of Rams History. Today we'll be discussing mercantilism. Now, if you'd like to take the dictionary definition of mercantilism, it's basically an economic theory that trade generates wealth, stimulated by the accumulation of profitable balances, which a government should encourage by means of protectionism. So why don't we take this definition and sort of flesh it out a little bit and talk about why this was such an important economic theory to many Europeans back during the 18th century. Now, first you have to understand that many Europeans did not live in the same world that we live in today. We live in sort of the world after the Industrial Revolution, where consumer goods are plentiful and want is really not something most people experience. Prior to the industrial and agricultural revolutions, the general thinking is that resources were scarce. There was only so much wealth out there, and that if you were going to obtain wealth, you had to obtain it at someone else's expense. So naturally, among the nations of Europe, there was a scramble to try to get as much wealth as possible. And again, the thinking is that this had to be done at the expense of everyone else. Because there was only a finite amount of resources out there, states had to accumulate them as best they could using whatever policies they could. In a sense, mercantilism is an extension of the warfare that many European states practiced in the 18th century. There was a lot of military conflict in the 18th century over colonies and other types of things. Mercantilism, in a sense, is the economic extension of that conflict. Now, the key feature of mercantilism here is this concept of bullion, essentially gold and silver reserves. Now, most nations today have gold and silver reserves, but largely we operate through what is called fiat currency today. We don't generally use currency that is actually backed by gold or silver. But at the time, what was considered important was that a nation stockpile gold and silver. You have to remember, gold and silver means power. If you accumulate gold and silver, you can equip your armies, you can purchase weapons, you can build ships for your navy. So it's all about the bullion, in a sense, with mercantilism. You have to accumulate this at the expense of others. Now, the thinking was that the best way to accumulate bullion was to maintain what was called a favorable balance of trade. In order to do that, it was critical that exports had to be greater than imports. You had to be selling more than buying. So keep this in mind. It kind of makes sense, right? If you're selling, you're making money. If you're buying, you're spending money. So the goal here is to sell much more than you buy and thereby increase your reserves of gold and silver. Now, mercantilist policies were practiced all over Europe, but we can take France as an example. The leading advocate of mercantilism there was Jean-Baptiste Colbert. He was the Minister of Finance for King Louis XIV. And the policies he followed were designed to strengthen France and make France much more powerful for the conflicts it had to be involved in. Now, Colbert followed economic policies that in one form or another were actually followed by most other European countries. For example, he used high protective tariffs. The goal of these tariffs was to protect home industry from cheaper imports. He also encouraged certain favored industries through subsidies. So certain types of industries would actually receive money from the state to help make them more profitable or to help them grow. In addition, certain key industries were granted state monopolies, which effectively protected them from any competition. Now today, the general thinking is that monopolies are harmful and that competition benefits the consumer, but at the time, the key here was to reduce the risk for certain amounts of the economy or certain areas of the economy. So really, in a sense, mercantilism involved a very strong hand, the strong hand of the state controlling the economy. And again, the key here was to reduce risk. So for example, you have a key industry you want to grow and protect. You protect that key industry from foreign competition through high tariffs, And then you also protect that key industry from domestic competition by granting them essentially a monopoly to produce goods within your own state. So the whole point here is to minimize risk and to try to grow the economy through this sort of powerful control of the state. Now, as I mentioned, there were certain key industries that were favored in mercantilist policies, and these were generally true throughout Europe. First of all, trade is a key feature of mercantilism. Obviously, you want to export your goods, you want to have colonies, and to do that, you need to have a strong shipping industry. So throughout Europe, you see states tending to favor shipyards and industries that manufacture shipping. You also, to an extent, see a push to develop navies, such as the Royal Navy in Britain, because these navies will then protect your trade and protect your overseas trade routes. In France, there was a major push to produce high-end consumer goods, luxury goods. This is something that actually the French are sort of continue to be known for today. Think about, for example, brands like Louis Vuitton and things like that. So high fashion, high-end consumer goods, right? France was meant to be a leader in that. And in fact, if you look at Versailles, which was constructed during this period by Louis XIV, many of the items in Versailles, the goldware, the statuary, the glass, all of these things were manufactured by French artisans. A final area that was favored, really in a sense, makes a lot of sense. It was military weaponry. You know, obviously, if you want your military to be strong, you want to be able to be competitive in military warfare, it doesn't make a lot of sense to depend upon foreign nations for your weapons. So most nations actually encouraged armaments manufacturing within their own borders. Now, another key part of mercantilist theory were colonies. Colonies had several functions. First of all, they provided raw materials, and in addition, they also provided a market for finished goods. Again, remember, the idea here is to keep bullion within your own country. So in a sense, colonies provided a self-contained trading system in which bullion sort of never left to the confines of your own nation. Instead of having to trade with foreign countries for raw materials, you could obtain them from your own colonies, turn them into finished goods, and then sell those goods back to your colonies again. So in a sense, it was a self-contained bubble in which bullion never left. Now, basically, colonies were meant to provide raw materials, and these could include things like sugar, cotton, tobacco, coffee, indigo, other types of things, furs, timber, just sort of depending on the colony. But the basic concept was the same. Colonies were meant to be a resource through which these valuable raw materials could be obtained. Now, the various nations of Europe attempted to keep their colonies under very strict control. Again, the idea here is to reduce foreign competition. So we don't want foreigners trading with our colonies. We don't want our colonies trading with foreigners. So the various countries adopted laws and policies to prevent that from happening. For example, the Spanish had what they called the flota system. In Great Britain, there were the Navigation Acts, which were passed over a period of years. And the point of these laws was essentially, again, to prevent any type of foreign competition and to prevent the colonies from trading with anyone else but you. Now, these laws did cause problems. For example, the Navigation Acts were in many ways unpopular in the American colonies, and in fact, they would become one of the major irritants which eventually would lead to the American Revolution. Another problem that both Spain and Britain experienced is that in general, these laws were very hard to enforce. Remember, your colonies tend to be far away, they tend to be over great distances, and it was very difficult for both nations to actually prevent things like smuggling and keep a tight control over these colonial areas. Now, another downside of mercantilism, ladies and gentlemen, is that it encouraged a great deal of competition between nations. Now, this was already an era of great competition, so mercantilism simply, in a sense, made it worse. And in fact, mercantilism would actually lead to open warfare, particularly between France and Great Britain. Here in what would eventually become the United States, we experienced what was known as the French and Indian War. And in addition, France and Britain would also clash over India, who got to control that area. Now, the Spanish would actually hold on to their colony here in the New World, or colonies here in the New World, for a very long time. In fact, many Spanish colonies remained in place until well into the 19th century. But another big problem the Spanish experienced was the fact that in their colonies, there was a very sort of strict caste system. For example, the Peninsulares, the people who were born in Spain, held most of the political power in the colonies, and then, of course, people who were born in the colonies or people who were of mixed descent had less and less power. So in the Spanish colonies in particular, you had a system where a very small number of people at the top held most of the control while the vast majority had very little. This caused a lot of instability in Spain's colonies and eventually would lead to the independence movements that took place there in the 19th century. And of course, perhaps the most negative aspect of all of this is that many of these colonies, English, French, and Spanish, were based upon slavery, particularly on the sugar plantations of the West Indies. And again, I cannot underestimate how brutal these conditions must have been. People uprooted from Africa, transported overseas, subjected to sickness, brutality, the loss of their culture, the loss of their religion, the loss of their language, and then forced to work under very harsh conditions. So please keep in mind as we talk about mercantilism that this was a system that was operated sort of at great human cost by many peoples, particularly the peoples of Africa. And of course, mercantilism led to the famous triangular trade. Many of you may recall this from your study of American history. But in essence here, a quick summary, slaves would be transported from Africa to the West Indies and North America. From that point, of course, they would be traded for raw materials, cotton, sugar, tobacco, molasses, timber, furs. These raw materials would then be transported back to the various nations of Europe. They would then be converted into finished or manufactured goods. And these manufactured goods would often be transported back to Africa or back to the colonies in exchange for either slaves or more raw materials. Now, it's important to know that, generally speaking, no single ship made the entire triangular voyage. Typically, a ship would only make one leg or another, but this was the general trade route that mercantilism tended to follow in the 18th century. All right, ladies and gentlemen, so let's do a quick recap here. Mercantilism is an economic theory based on strong state control of trade, key industries, and colonies. Again, the entire goal here is to accumulate wealth at the expense of other nations, in particular gold and silver bullion. States would often try to eliminate economic risk by offering subsidies to key industries, giving certain industries monopolies within domestic production, and also protecting industries from foreign competition through tariffs. Colonies were a key factor in mercantilist thinking because they provided raw materials and a market for finished goods. Again, the negative side of mercantilism, slavery with all of its dehumanizing features, was a major aspect of mercantilist economic policy. And of course, also the competition for trade in colonies led to increased warfare between the states of Europe. And eventually, of course, mercantilism thinking or mercantilist thinking would fall out of favor after about 1750, mainly because the agricultural and industrial revolutions were leading to increasing forms of wealth, and also because new theories, for example, Adam Smith was hit with his invisible hand, would lead to a decline in mercantilist thinking. So eventually, mercantilist economic policies would fall out of favor all across Europe. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this has been another episode of Ram's History, and I do hope you've enjoyed your time here. And of course, if you do, please like and subscribe. We're always happy to have you around. Thank you very much, and we'll see you again next time.